China's authoritarian ruler Xi Jinping looks to be preparing his people for war. He's banned boy bands, stepped up ideological enforcement and indoctrination education, and even instituted masculinity training in schools. In July 2021, at the centennial of the founding of the Communist Party of China, he left the world with a veiled warning. We will never allow any foreign force to bully, oppress, or subjugate us. Anyone who would attempt to do so will find themselves on a collision course with a Great Wall of Steel forged by over 1.4 billion Chinese people. But will Xi Jinping's China dream become the world's nightmare? Could we be closer to this nightmare than anyone might have guessed? In this video, we'll explore just how close a war with China might be and why we are now entering the most dangerous period in the rivalry between China and the United States. Buckle up. Until relatively recently, the world saw the rise of China as beneficial. Its huge market would open new opportunities for the global economy. Western leaders and experts hoped that economic liberalization would lead to political liberalization. However, there were early warning signs that this would not be the case. In the Third Taiwan Strait crisis of 1995–96, China fired a series of missiles in response to the island's first direct presidential election and the visit of its leader to the United States. Some of these missiles landed only 35 miles away from the Taiwanese ports of Keelung and Kaohsiung. China's actions disrupted maritime shipping and commercial air traffic, and it took the intervention of 2 American carrier groups to the area to force the Chinese to back off. This incident is mostly forgotten in the United States today. After all, it came at the height of the so-called American unipolar moment. China never forgot it though, and leaders in Beijing realized that they needed to modernize their country's military. China thus began its series of annual double-digit defense budget increases. By 2007, it was the world's second-largest military spender, a position it's not given up since. The year after the crisis, then Chinese leader Jiang Zemin met with Boris Yeltsin, the president of Russia at the time. The two leaders agreed that they would work toward a multipolar world order, and this agreement forms the basis of the strategic partnership between China and Russia today. China's extensive military training with Russia has helped to increase the readiness of its armed forces, although there is no substitute for the real thing, which China has lacked since the war with Vietnam in 1979. Still, China mostly emphasized its economic growth as a strategy for increasing its power in the international system. For example, after the incident of 1995–96, Chinese leaders began to stress an increase in the mainland's influence over Taiwan through economic interdependence, holding their tongues and fire even when pro-independence presidents were elected. But things began to change once Xi Jinping came to power in November 2012. With him, revanchist authoritarian ideology now met opportunity. By this time, China had entrenched itself at the center of many of the world's most important supply chains, including pharmaceuticals and rare earth elements. Military expansion came with this wealth, as China began to fortify real estate it claimed as its territory in the South China Sea. China also began to use its economic power far more coercively. Meanwhile, China's so-called wolf warrior diplomats increased international suspicion of their country's intentions. They made it seem like China was throwing its weight around at the expense of smaller countries. These actions, slowly but surely, forced them to join into a burgeoning coalition opposed to the power of the would-be new hegemon in the Indo-Pacific region. Xi Jinping's tenure in power has therefore ended the previous hopes that the West had of a China changing its stripes through the force of global trade. China has gotten more authoritarian and more threatening with its newfound wealth, not less. Although the rate of annual defense budget increases slowed under Xi, his reforms have made China's military less of a force meant for deterrence and defense, and more of one meant for overseas power projection. Colonel Grant Newsham, the United States Marine Corps' former head of intelligence for the region, claimed on Australian television in 2021 that the immediate purpose of China's military buildup was to invade Taiwan. In his words, "Who would the military buildup deter? Have you heard anybody say that they wanted to attack China?" Suspicion is rising, and with good reason. The Indo-Pacific region and the wider world increasingly resembles the environment in Europe leading up to World War I, with opposing alliance networks gradually forming. On the one hand, there is the existing leader in the international system, the United States, attempting to maintain the status quo in the region along with its network of allies. The other is China, a rising power that wants to change the status quo to be slanted more in its favor. Like Germany and Europe back then, China has rapidly emerged as the largest economy in the area, one which has also increased its military power, including by building a strong navy to compete with the dominant state in the international system. This is not the only resemblance, but we'll get to historical parallels in a bit. Right now, China is watching America's commitment to Ukraine carefully. If Ukraine is defeated, the chance that Beijing will attempt to assert itself through military force in its own regional backyard increases. To fight a war against China, it's necessary for the United States to ship troops and supplies across thousands of miles of ocean. This is not only expensive and risky, it's also psychologically difficult. The American people will be dealing with the knowledge that their soldiers are being sacrificed in a far-off conflict that might not directly threaten them. From there, political pressure could mount to end the war. This is ultimately what happened in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and it's one of the things that Beijing is counting on to give it an advantage over the United States in the event of war. Despite China's increasing capability, it still cannot defeat the United States military in a full-blown conventional showdown. However, it has the benefit of fighting close to its homeland, against only part of America's forces, and where public support will likely be easier to maintain. This is what Sun Tzu meant when he talked about the moral law of warfare, which causes the people to be in complete accord with their ruler, undismayed by any danger. Chinese strategists understand this well, and it's one of these things that increases the risk of war in the relatively near future. Despite some loud voices in Congress protesting additional Ukrainian aid, support for sending weapons remains fairly high among the American public. In a Gallup poll from November 2023, 63% of Democrats and 33% of Republicans said that the United States was providing either too little or the right amount of military aid. 44% of independents, the group that decides most American elections, agreed. 18% of Republicans and 21% of Democrats and 22% of independents said they were unsure. This is a majority over the 48% of Republicans, 16% of Democrats, and 31% of independents who said America was providing too much aid. The results suggest that the American people want Congress to stand by international allies and partners against the aggression of authoritarian regimes. In particular, it's important for the United States to make the Chinese leadership believe that it will come to the aid of Taiwan in the event that it's attacked. Taiwan is the most important flashpoint for a potential conflict because it sits at the center of ideological, economic, and geopolitical fault lines. Ideologically, the regime in Beijing sees Taiwan as a rogue province, a legacy from China's civil war and the century of humiliation it climaxed. Xi Jinping has made the reincorporation of the island to the mainland's control his top foreign policy priority and has staked a significant amount of his personal prestige on the project. Increased grey zone operations and massive exercises around the island have further tied his reputation to this place, making it harder for him to back down from a confrontation without losing face. Economically, Taiwan is the world's leading producer of semiconductors, which are components in most of the important parts of the modern economy. Phones, television sets, motor vehicles, household appliances, and many more products use them. The island supplies 60% of the world's total. Semiconductors are also critical components in modern high-tech weapons. Even in the event of a failed invasion, China would still disrupt this vital supply chain and cause disastrous economic consequences. Geopolitically, Taiwan sits at the center of the First Island chain. The string of islands currently acts as a natural line of fortifications against Chinese attempts to project military power further away from its homeland. It also commands choke points that China's maritime trade depends on. China gaining control over Taiwan would enable it to break the containment of the First Island chain by giving it the ports and air infrastructure to project power much further into the Pacific. These are the reasons why a few months before his assassination, the former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe said on television that the United States should drop strategic ambiguity and clarify that it will defend Taiwan from a Chinese attack. So far, the United States has not done so, in keeping with the One China policy that's been in place since 1972. Under the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979, the United States guarantees to provide the island the ability to maintain a sufficient self-defense capability. The United States thus supplies arms to Taiwan, but the act is not an alliance or mutual self-defense treaty. Since there is no official recognition of Taiwan, there cannot be such a treaty. Therefore, the United States could find it convenient to back off and exercise strategic ambiguity to the fullest. On the other hand, the United States has a lot to lose if it does not come to the defense of Taiwan, even beyond the economic and immediate geopolitical concerns. Although the United States would technically not be violating any treaty obligations by failing to do so, it would send a signal of weakness that would undermine its position as the leader of the alliance network it's constructed around the globe since the end of World War II. Unlike Ukraine, which was part of the Soviet Union until its collapse, the United States has implied that it would indeed defend Taiwan from an invasion as soon as the Chinese Civil War ended. In the First Taiwan Strait crisis of 1954–55, when the mainland shelled the Kinmen and Matsu Islands, China unsuccessfully attempted to prevent the United States from signing a mutual defense treaty with Taiwan. In the second crisis of 1958, the Eisenhower administration went so far as to make plans to use nuclear weapons on the mainland if need be. America eventually renounced the treaty with Taiwan in favor of the mainland, but continued to supply it with weapons and insist that the dispute across the strait be resolved peacefully. Refusing to confront China in the face of an invasion would be America turning its back on nearly 80 years of foreign policy tradition. And there are other ways today's situation resembles World War I. China feels increasingly threatened by the coalition being forged in the region. It's called the Quad between the United States, Australia, India, and Japan as an attempt to containment through the means of an Asian NATO. In the first version of the Quad in 2007, China issued formal diplomatic protests to the participating members. Beijing maintains the same vigorous opposition today, but unlike back then, this opposition is little regarded. China's actions to militarize the South China Sea, its use of economic coercion on countries like Australia, and its behavior during the COVID-19 pandemic has forced other states, particularly those in its backyard, to take America's side. These states are also militarizing. Japan recently renounced decades of pacifism and confirmed that it would spend 2% of its GDP on defense by 2027. Its new armaments will include missiles that can strike deep into the Chinese heartland, hypersonic missiles, increased amphibious capabilities, and a planned sixth-generation fighter jet. South Korea has become more skeptical of China and strengthened ties with Japan under President Yoon. As a result, the United States, Japan, and South Korea held their first trilateral exercise in 2023. The Philippines, too, is strengthening its military capabilities thanks to a series of renewed American bases permitting cross-training with the United States. Meanwhile, Taiwan continues to receive American aid and is developing a deep strike capability, ensuring that it can hit targets in the Chinese heartland if it were attacked. Some of these missiles will be able to hit Beijing. Through its military buildup, China acquired an enormous hard power advantage over its neighbors. But in the next decade, those states that were once at a severe disadvantage will make the contest more equal and have much greater ability to hit back at China than they do today. China would still have hard power superiority, but the costs for attempting to remake the status quo in the region by force would be a lot higher. China is facing a limited time window in other ways. After decades of breakneck growth, the Chinese economic engine is slowing down. Since passing Japan as the world's second-largest economy in 2010, China's growth has trended downward. That year, China grew by 10.6%. In 2022, China grew by 3%, low by its standards. China is facing much deeper problems to boot. It will not get the return that it hoped for on its Belt and Road investments. Its real estate market is troubled. More importantly, China is facing a demographic cliff. It peaked in population in about 2020 and has begun a steady decline. Demographers predict that China will only have about half the people it has now by the end of the century. Its population is therefore about to age rapidly. To make matters worse, China has a shortage of women of childbearing age thanks to decades of the one-child policy, which meant that daughters were preferentially aborted or abandoned in favor of sons. As China's population ages, it will need to look more inward than outward, spending more money on elder care and less on its military. It will also have fewer soldiers to call on. Because of all these factors, China's relative power in the Indo-Pacific region has peaked or is close to peaking. This puts additional pressure on the leadership in Beijing because by 2049, the year Xi aims to complete the incorporation of Taiwan into the mainland, it may be too late. This now or never mentality increases the dangers that Xi and those around him will decide to make a move on Taiwan before the window of opportunity closes, and it will not get the chance to use military power it's invested in to its maximum potential. There is World War I-era historical precedent for this. In the decade before war broke out, Britain and France ended 1,000 years of on-and-off conflict with the Entente Cordiale of 1904. This was not a formal military alliance, but it contributed to Germany's growing sense of being surrounded by hostile powers. Russia was also recovering from its defeat in the Russo-Japanese War. By 1918, Russia was scheduled to complete the rearmament program it was in the midst of with the assist of its French ally, and Germany began to fear the new capabilities Moscow would bring to the table when this project was completed. These capabilities included a 39% increase in Russian manpower and a significant increase in artillery. Russia was also building a large railroad in its western localities adjacent to the borders of Germany and its ally, Austria-Hungary, meaning that it would be able to easily supply its troops for offensive operations to the west. During the crisis of July 1914 that led to the war, the sense in Berlin was that it would be better to move now rather than wait for Germany's enemies to get stronger. Like China now, Germany's relative economic and military power in the region was peaking. German leaders felt compelled to act at the moment of their strength rather than give time for their enemies to grow stronger. This is precisely the situation in the Indo-Pacific now. The presence of nuclear weapons acts as a much more powerful deterrent than was the case in 1914, but these arms also increased the stakes dramatically. In July of that year, Germany tried to reason that it would be able to fight a local war with Russia without bringing France in. These hopes proved misguided. Since Taiwan does not have a formal alliance with the United States, Chinese leaders might hope for the same, but Taiwan is close to Japan and the Philippines, countries that do have formal alliances with America. The danger to them adds pressure for the United States to respond, even if it can ignore the danger to Taiwan. Hopes to keep local wars local rarely end well when such alliances are involved. While the South China Sea poses the biggest risk of an accidental conflict, Taiwan acts as the geopolitical flashpoint where pride, national interest, and constraints of time all meet. As the world rearms and forms into democratic and authoritarian camps, there are several potential flashpoints to spark a conflict, but if disaster is brought on willingly, this is the likeliest place. But do you think that a war in the Indo-Pacific is closer than we might imagine? Will a war-weary and politically divided America come to the defense of Taiwan, or will China's uncertainty about this goad it into rolling the dice when it has the best chance of winning? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.